Joe Sublette and I wrote a song. It's called I Was Blind. I don't know if it'll ever be on a Phantom Blues Band record because it's not that kind of song, but hopefully we'll find somebody who wants it. And the reason I'm talking about it really is because of the piano, which used to belong to Richard Manuel. And it's now here in my studio where it belongs.
Ultratone, one word, right?
Ultratone. Yeah, I was looking through an old Gibson guitar catalog about 20 years ago or more, and there were some lap steels in there, and they were kind of they were Art Deco looking, sort of turquoise and white, coral pink and black, and one of them was called an Ultratone, and I thought that was such a cool name that I said.
And it's just for the record, it's one word.
Yeah,
I love it too. Could you just play the melody of that song you wrote with Sublette?
See, I'll play the chorus. Let's see, because once I got the chorus, then I kind of. Seriously, I got to remember. First idea I had that went in the song. It was a little turnaround. I had to mess around with had to figure out the verses, which probably took the longest.
Folks, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show. We're here in Los Angeles with just a phenomenal cat, legendary guitarist and musician and record producer, Johnny Lee Schell. Welcome to the program, my friend.
Piano owner.
Piano owner.
I'm not a piano player, but I'm a piano owner.
Can you just, let the audience... What was confounding to me is that, and you mentioned it at the outset, was that this was Richard Manuel's piano at Shangri-La.
It was.
How did you wind up?
I first started recording out there in about 1978 or 9 with Ian McLagan. We were doing an album of his called "Bumpin' the Night." Ricky Fataris was playing drums, and a Japanese bass player, Ray O'Hara, great bass player, was playing bass. So we were a 4-piece band, and we were recording at Shangri-La, and this piano was there. When Mac used to play it every night, and
Dr. John?
No, Ian McLagan.
Oh, Ian McLagan, yeah.
So we were recording there one night, and Bonnie Raitt came in. She was looking for studios and a place to record her next album, and she ended up using the studio and the band and the producer and the whole thing. We made an album called Green Lights in 1981 or
right.
so. And we also made a Renee Gayer album, an Australian singer, fabulous combination of Mavis Staples and Aretha Franklin. She's like the Aretha Franklin of Australia.
That's saying a lot.
White Jewish Hungarian woman.
Wow.
Doesn't sound like she looks. And so check her out. She made an album called So Lucky, which sounds fabulous to this day. That's a big test of music to me, as if it stands the test of time. If it continues 20, 30, 40 years later to sound like it's not dated, still sounds soulful, then you know you really accomplished something, and to me, that era in time. But anyway, that's where I first became aware of this piano, and then eventually that studio closed, and another friend of mine bought the piano, and he had a studio in Hollywood, and we used to go in there and make demos and whatever. Then he moved to Connecticut and took the piano with him. And then another friend of mine ended up buying it from him and bringing it back here. And it was in storage over in Reseda somewhere, and he asked me if I'd like to put it in the studio, and I, of course, said yes, and it came here. It had 2 broken keys. It had the D and the F.
Are you able to pull that wood board out, the
Yeah,
with the message on it?
And you can see the fall box here got cracked. Obviously, in shipping, something hit the fall box and broke these 2 keys. Because these keys are about 3 feet long. So the piano repairman glued them back together, and Ian McLagan left a little message here.
Yeah. Let's just show this off to the audience here.
I don't know what this piece of wood is called, but it covers the end of the keyboard. And it says, "This piano stolen from Richard Manuel. I love this Joanna," which is English slang for piano. "Give it to me. Big love, Mac, 1981.
Johnny, it's so great to talk to you, man. It's so great to hang with you. And Richard's spirit is with us and must be here quite often whenever.
Yeah, his widow knows that I have the piano and is very happy that I have it. And I'm happy I have it too.
You know, you mentioned something to me in our radio interview about you were very, very upfront about the fact that you didn't really play with any good drummers until Ricky Fitara.
Well, that's probably an exaggeration.
But I want you to talk to cats out there about how liberating it was for you as a guitar player to have somebody there that was not playing.
Well, it just gave me total rhythmic freedom, you know. I didn't have to worry about every time there was a drum fill if the one was not going to land where it's supposed to land, you know. And so having the confidence of that after about playing with him for about 30 seconds gave me the freedom to make the grooves wider. You know, I could play. I didn't have to emphasize exactly where every beat was going to come. I could play more accents, and it made grooves feel sort of. It's that Keith Richards and Charlie Watts thing, where Charlie's so solid, and Keith is such a great rhythm player, and that's why the rhythm tracks sound like that, you know. And then there's other examples you could cite.
No, you know what it was? What was your concept before when you were playing with drummers who were rushing the beat? Like, how did it affect you mentally? Where you had to compensate maybe, or felt?
Well, I had to help guide the track stay together and not fall apart, you know. And it's a subtle thing, but it gets to be very important, you know. And you're sort of, it's like you're fighting against the time. And when you no longer have to do that, then you've got like Steve Cropper and Al Jackson, and you know, you've got things like that it sounds so natural and so easy, but there's a understanding that has to be had by the players, and if they don't understand that, then it's sort of like constant conflict, you know. And
push and pull, yeah.
Yeah, and when that conflict goes away, there's an ease to a track and a rhythm that happens, and it's almost a subconscious kind of thing. When listeners hear it, they understand it and feel it. They may not know where it comes from, but they definitely know that they want to get up and dance to this song. And some others, maybe not so much. You talked about the regional water and the idea that in Texas you guys inherently play behind the beat in rhythm sections, and that you've had to hip some serious cats, legendary players, to that
rhythm. I mean, was it surprising to you that a lot of people that have been playing for many years at very high levels still were not able to get in the groove?
It was at first, and then I sort of came to expect it later on.
You came to expect it?
Yeah. And sometimes it's sort of about having the same musical language, you know. If you come from the same region of the country, then oftentimes you will have had the same influences and play in a similar manner. The exception to that with us is that we've had plenty of English keyboard players that we've played with over the years. I mean, I could name a whole slew of them.
Who could you name a couple? I wasn't even aware of that.
Started with playing with Nicky Hopkins way back in the 70s, and then Ian McLagan, of course, came along, and then there was John Cleary in Taj Mahal's band, and before him, Mick. Oh golly, I'm having a senior moment.
Come back.
Anyway, English keyboard players. I mean, there's the Chris Stanton is another one you could name. I mean, they understand. A lot of the English players, in general, have a lot of sympathy with the Southern blues rock kind of thing. You know, they understand that vibe of playing like that. It's sort of like being in general, a more laid-back person, you know, sort of not being antsy and being comfortable with yourself and the people that are around you, and having a conversation, a musical conversation while you're playing, you know, being able to listen as well as play at the simultaneously. So that is a sort of an art in itself, you know, not just concentrating on what you're doing, but also being able to totally take in every other person who's playing at the same time you're playing. Every little nuance they play is going to affect what you do. You know, that's why if we sometimes have someone who's not playing quite in the pocket with us, it's just a big chore to try to ignore that. You know, I may Tony has it easy because he has his own cue. I'll just turn that person down, you know, and he'll just plow through it, and then we'll just go back and fix it later or whatever. If it's a situation that we can't avoid, you know, someone's husband or brother or the guy who's paying for the session is playing an instrument that's not quite happening, and it's something you can't get around, then you just make the best of it and either replace it later or repair it somehow.
One thing I wanted to follow up on, the guy with the initials EC who came in and was ahead of the beat the whole time.
That was just one particular song, you know, and it happened to have quite a few breaks in it.
But you said to him, think back to when you played with the Tulsa guys.
Yeah.
So is it possible for people to grasp it and then lose it over time?
I think so. He just wasn't expecting us to have that sort of feel, and he was sort of in the studio with a bunch of strangers, and you know, probably a bit nervous, and everything came out totally fine. That obviously one of my heroes and a great musician.
Absolutely.
And love him to death. And that was just happened to be one of those days where there was one particular song that wasn't quite working, and we just asked him to lay back in time. We're pretty open about it, you know, not in the most gracious way possible.
Johnny, I need you, like, so for instance, you can go back, Tony's got his own signal when somebody's, you know, you can go back and fix stuff. But with Norman Petty, can you talk about a time that was inspiring to you when he didn't have the technology? You couldn't go back and just fix it.
Yeah, he was the first, he was producing our little teenage band, you know, we were just, it may have been our first or second time in the studio. I think the first time we went in that studio, George Tomsko was producing it. He was the guitar player in the Fireballs, and but then another subsequent band I went in there with it, Norman, did the recording and was basically helping us, trying to help us to make it better. And he was the first one I ever heard mention how a track felt, because we thought if we went in and we played the chords and didn't make any mistakes and made it from the beginning to the end of the song that we had a good take. We didn't really understand the way that everything's supposed to lay together timing wise, and that was a big eye opener for me as probably a 16-year-old musician early on, and it helped me understand that some other things are equally important when you're making a track.
Could you give one example of something that you held on to from that time that you incorporate into Ultratone still today?
Well, I think a big thing would be everyone playing together. We had no choice back then because overdubbing was very limited. But now you can basically, if you wanted to, you could record one drum at a time. You could play the bass drum and then play the snare drum, But we know that's not going to get us where we want to go. So we all just play together like we normally would have played together 40 years ago, and I think that's one very, very basic approach to making rhythm tracks, especially, that we think is important and works for us.
Yeah, let's just be clear. I mean, here at Ultratone, it's the Phantom Blues rhythm section. Fulcher, Finnegan, Tony, they're always recording together.
Yes.
No matter who the artist is, whether they come in and do the vocals up into Bang Canyon, wherever it is.
Yeah. And usually we'll have a singer in the corner at least singing a guide vocal, some of which get kept. I mean, we did parts of Taj Mahal's Maestro album here, and he was singing live in the corner, and we kept, I think, 4 out of 6 of his vocals were live vocals, and the horns were playing, sitting right beside him there. And we kept the live horn solos, and he played banjo on one track and sang, and so things can be done even in a small room if you're creative and if people don't play a lot of clamps,
I mean, I was going to ask you. You have that Beale Street sign out there. Was when Baby was cooking? I mean, did you cross paths, or did you? How infatuated were you with that Memphis Stack sound, like specifically the Duck Dunn and Al Jackson rhythm?
I was always enamored with soul music and blues, and then I got sucked into that band, and it was basically a straight-ahead rock band, and they didn't want to know about any blues.
Talking about Baby.
Yeah, I mean, it was partly to do with the manager they had at that time. He thought his musical taste was not the same, and because I came from more of a blues-based, roots-based background, and I could always. We started out at the same time ZZ Top was starting out, playing in the same circuits and junior colleges,
Moose
Moose lodges.
Yeah, I love it. You just flipped right over the Chitlin circuit.
And they of course were a blues-based band who had a little success. So I think he was wrong, and I'll have to say I told you so.
When you first, it's so fascinating. I mean, you came out here. How did you actually link up with Bonnie Raitt?
Well, I had known Bobby Keys, a sax player who gained fame by playing the sax solo and Brown Sugar. Basically, he did lots of other stuff too, as we all know. But he and I were pretty good friends for quite a while. I don't remember where I first met him. because it was so long ago. But I wrote a rock and roll song called "Little Troublemaker," and recorded a demo in my house, I think, on a little TX 4-track or something. And Bobby played a tenor solo in it, and he was very happy with that, and played it for Ian McLagan. They were on the Stones tour. I think it was Miss You, the Miss You tour. Mac played keyboards on that tour, and so when they came off that tour, Ian McLagan got a record deal with Mercury to do a solo album, and he loved that song, and I began working with him, writing the rest of the songs, and "Little Troublemaker" became the title track for that album. And Jim Kellner played drums on that, and
What year did that come out? It's like 79 or
78 probably.
Uh-huh.
And Ringo played on 2 tracks, and he had Keith. Well, he had basically what was that band that Keith and Ronnie had that they went out and toured with? They had their own band they did for a while.
Yeah, someone from the audience will have to chime in, but
it's escaping me. And so Ronnie Wood came in and played on a couple of songs, and I started flowing around in that circuit with Keith and Ronnie and Bobby Keys and Joe Cocker and stuff like that. And as I said before, we were making Mac's second album out at Shangri-La when Bonnie came looking for a studio, and she liked what we were doing, and so she basically just came in and used the band and the producer and the studio, and we made a more or less Bonnie meets the Rolling Stones sort of record, not her typical ballads and folk stuff.
Interesting.
And a much more happy rock record, which did nothing basically for her. But I ended up, me and Mac and the bass player Ray O'Hara ended up going on the road with Bonnie to support that album, and they eventually left, and I stayed in Bonnie's band for the next 10 or 12 years, all throughout the 80s into the early 90s when we made Nick of Time and Luck of the Draw.
Was Tony on drums?
He came along in about 84 or 85.
You talk about how liberating it is to play with a drummer like Tony, especially in the live context.
Yeah, well, we are so familiar with each other that it's because some songs don't happen the same every night. There are little things that change.
Yep.
The ending may be different, and so we have the luxury of being familiar enough with each other that sometimes just a glance or a look on stage or a drum fill or playing a guitar lick will signal what's going to happen next without having rehearsed it or without having talked about it. And the same thing with Mike. I pretty well know the way he's going to approach the chord changes of a song before we even start to play it.
Right.
And I know that he's going to substitute and not play straight changes in some situations, and I'll play according to that. So it's the luxury of familiarity that we have of 20 years or so, or longer, 30. Speaking of Tony and I, and then with Larry having played in Taj's band for a good long while, the combination of the bass player and drummer obviously is paramount importance, getting the lock-in of the bottom end of the song, that is to say, the bass drum and the bass playing a rhythm that works together to give the song more power.
Fulcher's a Houston cat.
Yeah.
So, and then Finnegan too. I mean, Finn's, you never cross paths with him on the baby circuit.
Never, no.
You remember the first time you connected with him? Was it in the studios out here? Or?
Well, I moved onto this street in about '85, and Mike and Candy were living at the end of the street, about a block away.
Right here.
Yeah.
Wow.
They lived at the last house by the park. And the second day I was here, his kids were about 5 and 7, I guess, at that time. They brought their bicycles down here. I think they were just snooping. But they pretended that they wanted to have me work on their bicycles, which I did. And I showed them how to take a playing card and a clothespin and make it sound like a motor. And they thought that was pretty cool.
But I mean, can you talk about this idea of almost telepathy when you get into a groove with someone you know so well musically, when you know what they're going to play before they even play it?
And it's sort of that way with it. It sometimes takes a bit of time, but
no, I was going to say, does it happen? It can happen instantaneously too.
It can, yeah. It's kind of like love at first sight, you know.
I dig.
Or else it may take a while.
I dig, man.
But basically, it's about having speaking the same musical language, you know, and sort of knowing how you want it to sound, and it may come out different than that, but it usually, the difference may be even better than what you had in mind in the first place.
Yeah, well, that was my next thing. Is I just would like you to define. I asked you last time about specific, but what is a happy accident to Johnny Lee Schell, and why are they important in that when you're doing live rhythm tracks for a studio?
Well, you'll be playing along, and someone, let's say Mike has an idea, and he just plays it. You know, within the context of you're playing along, and you get. Maybe it's building up, and he plays something that builds it up, and then I'll play something on top of that builds it up, and because when we often do tracks here, we write out chord charts.
Sure.
You know, and they're pretty basic. We leave them kind of loose because the song often changes. You know,
I love it.
Where sections of the song happen, we may say, well, there should be another bridge after the solo, you know, and it's not written in the chart. We'll just make a note, you know, play a bridge after the solo, whatever. And the dynamics, unlike, say, in classical music, the dynamics are always written in. You know, this is called a piano. It's a piano forte because it can play pianissimo, which is very soft, or it can play forte, which is very loud. And that's always written out in classical music, but for pop music, it's left up to the players to figure out what the dynamics of the song should be, where the climax of the song is going to come, and if it should break down and clear out. Say, for example, you played a couple of verses and a chorus and a verse and a chorus, then you have a big solo. Then after the solo, do you want it to come down and kind of let up for at least the first half of the next verse before you gradually build it up toward the end? And sometimes those things are talked about, but usually they happen more or less naturally because it's a natural kind of feel thing that you feel, and the singer usually feels it too, and they sing less intensely when it should be quiet, and we consequently play less intensely.
Well, I mean, it's straight out of the. I mean, I told you this before. It's straight out of the Barry White, Gene Page book. When they brought in David T. Walker and Wilton Felder and Ed Green, they'd bring in chord changes, but no arrangements. It was very loose, and allowed the musicians to really think on their feet. And I think that to me is the salient part of Ultratone. Did you fiddle around in the studio scene in LA before you opened your own thing? I mean, if so, what was that experience like for you?
Well, in the 80s there was a ton of session work here.
Still,
you know, yeah, in the 80s. So I played in lots and lots of studios, and in those days, the cost of having a studio was really prohibitive for someone like myself. You know, I mean, a Studer 2-inch tape machine was about $200,000, you know, and the console's the same. If you wanted to get a really smoking Neve console, you know, it was more than buying a house. So these things weren't within the budget of musicians like myself, and only came about later on as things got more realistic. I mean, I still have probably $100,000 worth of equipment sitting right in here, and another at least that much in instruments. But that would have just been one tape machine in those days.
The console you're talking about, unless you were a cat like that had a huge record deal and got a budget that they could afford, it would cost you like $100,000 for that console.
Well, the Neve consoles were more like $250.
And that was in the 80s?
Yeah, well, the 70s and 80s.
And so only if you had a monster record deal from a big record company.
No, most musicians didn't have anything beyond maybe a TAG 4-track and a little something or other where you could make like a guitar and vocal demo, you know, and that was about it. Or maybe a little simple drum machine or something. And even successful artists didn't want to bother with having to spend $500,000 on just getting the gear, you know. Then there's always still a place to put it in and someone to run it, and you know, you had to have an engineer and usually an assistant engineer. Had to have someone who could align the tape machine and do all that sort of stuff and maintain stuff that broke. You know?
When did you get serious, and when did it become less prohibitive for you to open up Ultratone?
Well, let's see. I started.
People want to see your mouth, so you can.
Here in we moved to this house in '85, and
right.
this was just a garage. You know, it didn't even have drywall on the inside. All you saw were the 2x4s, you know, and you could look up and see the shingles on the roof. And I was working out here with a TAG 4-track and a little tiny. I mean, I had like a coffee table and
it was sparse.
One thing led to another, taking out the garage door and framing that in, and gradually just getting more and more sophisticated equipment over time. You know, it happened sort of in stages. It didn't happen all at once.
Can you talk a little bit about? Do you have any solo projects of your own coming up, or are you extremely content working on other people's music?
I don't have anything going on at the moment. I spend so much of my time sort of in the engineering part of it, and mixing, and that free time, which I probably would have used in songwriting before, or I still write songs, just not as many, you know. You sort of like use up your ideas, I guess, over time. I never was much of a lyric writer. I've written 20 or 30 songs where I wrote all the lyrics, but oftentimes I co-write with people who give me lyrics, or maybe write the lyrics together with somebody or whatever. I never really had all that much to say.
Well, that might be, you might be being overly critical. I mean, in your mind, you have melodies bouncing around all the time in your head. I'm just also wondering about the idea of telling a story within your solo. Even though Baby was a straight 4/4 rock boogie band, rock group, did you learn how to tell a story at that time, or was it an evolution that maybe occurred once you moved to the left coast?
Well, I always tried. In playing the solos, I always wanted them to be musical, you know, and not just a bunch of racket. I mean, that sometimes can be exciting in itself, but it gets annoying pretty quickly. And so I always was striving for the solos to actually mean something and say something, and not just be something that took up space in the middle of a song, you know, where you got to rest your vocal cords.
Did you, was that just an intrinsic feel, or did you have people saying, Johnny, you're wanking it?
No, that was just something that I would sometimes hear other bands and whatever. Sometimes you can always learn from listening to other players, even if it's something you don't want to do.
That's right. You often learn what you don't want. Yeah, I dig.
Sometimes learn, oh, that's great. No, don't want that. No. So I think it was a long learning process, like I said, by sort of trial and error on my part and listening to other players and trying to figure out what worked best and what was sort of like didn't need to be there. No.
Before we wrap up this set, I just would ask you if you could just play a little something on the keyboard, Ode to Richard Manuel.
Sure, I should have rehearsed. Maybe I.
Well, you'll be all right.
I could have thought of a band song, but.
Well, it's something for Richard and something for the holidays. I mean, this is.
The weight was probably written on this piano.
The Weight and
several others you can name.
Quite a few, man. Tears of Rage.
Let's see. If you find me in a gloom, catch me in a dream, inside my there is no in between. Whispering pines, rising of the time. If only one star shine, that's just enough to get inside. About all but I always loved Whispering Pines.
That's
and
the best.
As a matter of fact, when that Brown record came out, our little hippie band in Clovis, New Mexico, played that song. I don't think it was very danceable, but we liked it.
Johnny Lee, we'll do more down the road, man. I just thank you for letting me come in, and this place has been graced by so many beautiful human beings and musicians, and it's nice to know you're carrying on the spirit of the old-time recordings, and hopefully if this inspires a couple of younger engineers along the way.
Well, we feel like a lot of good things happen under this little roof, and we're going to keep doing it till they throw the dirt in our face.
Dig, man. Happy holidays, Johnny. Much love.
Okay. Merry Christmas, everybody.